What if I told you that one of humanity's oldest written records wasn't about kings, gods, or conquests? What if it was about something far more radical, a society wrestling with the right to exist? Today, we're diving into a story that textbooks gloss over because it asks uncomfortable questions about power, lineage, and legitimacy that still echo in our world today. But here's the twist. We're not just going to tell you what ancient Sumer said about this controversial generation. We're going to explore why what they wrote terrified rulers then, and why it should fascinate us now. Around 2100 BCE, Sumerian scribes wrote something extraordinary. They documented a generation of people, real, living people, who had a specific damning label. They weren't just called illegitimate, they were defined by an absence. They were the Ilkum, and what we translate as Ilkum today reveals a structure of power so deliberate, so calculated, that it makes you wonder, how much has really changed? But before we go deeper, I need to reframe something. This isn't a story about victimization or sorrow. This is a story about what happens when a society decides to formally, officially, in writing, create a category of human beings and then name them. Because naming something in writing is the most powerful act of control there is. When you write something down, you make it real. You make it permanent, you make it law. The Sumerians understood something that modern administrations would rediscover thousands of years later. Written categorization is bureaucratic control, and the Ilkum, this generation, they were the first to be bureaucratically defined as outside the legitimate order. Now, here's where the story gets uncomfortable. The Ilkum weren't enslaved. They weren't conquered in a traditional sense. They were something worse from the perspective of ancient law. They were unaccounted for. They existed in the cracks of the system. The first mistake we make is thinking the Sumerian economy worked like ours. It didn't. In Mesopotamia, everything was categorized. You were property of the temple. You were property of the palace. You were property of a guild. You had a place. You had a function. You had a reason to exist in the ledger. The Ilkum, though, they broke this. They were born to families outside the formal system. Perhaps their parents were from conquered territories. Perhaps they were born from unions that weren't officially registered. Perhaps they were born to people who had no documented role in society. The reasons varied, but the result was always the same. They had no entry in the ledgers. And that's not a poetic metaphor. They literally had no name in the system. But the Sumerians didn't just leave them unnamed. They couldn't, because absence in a bureaucratic system creates problems. Problems need to be solved with more bureaucracy. So they did something ingenious and deeply troubling. They created a label for the nameless. The word Ilkum literally translates to something close to dependent or one without patrimony, but that's sterile. What it really meant was born outside the law, born without the permission of the order, born uncategorized. Now, I want you to really think about this for a moment. We tend to romanticize the ancient world. We imagine wise scholars and philosophers pondering the mysteries of existence. But this wasn't philosophy. This was administration. This was a bureaucrat sitting down and saying, "We have a problem. We have people who don't fit, so we're going to give them a name, write it down, and make it official." Once you do that, once you write it down, it becomes law. Here's what makes this story relevant to us, and this is the part that the historical accounts often skip. The Ilkum weren't a tiny minority. By some estimates, in certain regions of Mesopotamia, they made up 10 to 15% of the population. That's not a fringe group. That's a significant portion of society that was officially, formally, in writing, categorized as illegitimate. And what happened to them? Here's where history gets murky, and that matters. The Ilkum were still working. They still existed economically. Some of them worked the land. Some of them were artisans. Some of them were laborers. They contributed to society. But their status was always marked, always known, always limiting their options, their rights, their ability to own property, marry into legitimate families, or claim inheritance. They were what we might call today an underclass. But they were an officially named, officially recognized, officially documented underclass. They didn't have to guess their status. It was written down. And you know what? They accepted it. For centuries, they accepted it. Because that's what happens when something is official. When it's written, when it's law, it becomes invisible. It stops being a choice and becomes a fact. The reason this matters to us, and I mean really matters, beyond historical curiosity, is that we inherited this model. We inherited the belief that if something is written down, if it's in the system, if it's official, then it must be true, and more importantly, it must be unchangeable. Governments do this, institutions do this, bureaucracies do this. They create categories, they write them down, and suddenly those categories become destiny. It becomes normal. It becomes accepted. It becomes the way things are. The Ilkum teaches us something crucial about how power works in complex societies. Power isn't always about violence or coercion, at least not visibly. Power is about definition. It's about who gets to write the official story. It's about who gets to decide what categories exist and what those categories mean. When the Sumerians created the category of Ilkum and wrote it down, they solved their administrative problem. They could now count these people, they could regulate them, they could control their movement and their rights, all through the power of official naming. But here's the thing that historians sometimes miss, and this is really the angle that changes everything. The Ilkum didn't disappear from history. They didn't vanish. They didn't get erased. They got absorbed. By the time of the Akkadian dynasties, maybe a century or two later, the distinction between Ilkum and the legitimately born becomes harder to find in the records. Why? Because either they were integrated or, and this is important, the system itself became so complex that everyone was confused about their status. Everyone became a little bit Ilkum. That's radical. That's the opposite of consolidation of control. That's the system breaking down under its own weight. And I think that's the real story that the tablets are trying to tell us. Not about oppression, though that was real, but about the fragility of bureaucratic systems. About how power that relies entirely on written categorization is powerful, yes, but also brittle. Brittle enough to break when too many people stop fitting the categories. The Sumerian system made the Ilkum visible. It wrote them into law. But in doing so, it also wrote them into history. And history, unlike a bureaucratic ledger, has a way of complicating categorization. What the Sumerians didn't anticipate, what no bureaucracy anticipates, is that the moment you create an official category, you also create the seeds of its dissolution. Once you say, these people are Ilkum, you've also given those people a name to rally around, a shared identity, a reason to organize. This is something that came up much later in history. Oppressed groups often find power in the very categories that oppress them. The labels that were meant to diminish them become badges of identity. The Ilkum were once defined by what they lacked. But what if that lack became their strength? We don't have a record of Ilkum rebellion. We don't have texts written from their perspective. But that absence itself is information. The fact that Sumerian records are dominated by elite perspectives, temple administrators, palace officials, wealthy merchants, tells us that the Ilkum, despite being officially categorized, also had something else, invisibility within the visible system. They existed in the gaps, in the margins, in the spaces that bureaucracy couldn't quite reach. That's where the real power was, not in the category itself, but in being able to escape the gaze that the category required. This brings us to something that modern sociology has recognized, but that ancient Sumer somehow already understood. The creation of an underclass doesn't control it. It names it, and naming it is actually the first step toward its resistance. The Sumerians wrote down that the Ilkum existed. They gave them a name. They created records. In doing so, they created a documentary trail that we can follow thousands of years later. They immortalized the existence of a group they intended to marginalize. That's the irony that echoes through history. When you officially categorize people, you do more than create control. You create documentation. You create the possibility of history. You ensure that they will be remembered, even if incompletely, even if distorted, even if only in the margins of official records. The Ilkum were meant to be invisible in a different sense, not invisible because they weren't there, but invisible because they didn't matter. They weren't supposed to leave a mark on history, but they did, because Sumerian bureaucracy required it. And this is where the story gets even more fascinating. Because the Ilkum weren't just a footnote in some obscure administrative record, they appear across multiple tablets, in different cities, spanning different periods. This wasn't a one-time clerical note. This was a pattern, a system, a reality that kept reasserting itself despite every effort to suppress it. The Sumerians had created what we might call the first permanent record of social exclusion. They had, quite inadvertently, invented a way to make the invisible visible through the very act of trying to keep them separate. Think about that for a moment. In a world without photography, without video, without newspapers or broadcasts, the only way for something to survive into the historical record was to be written down. And the only institutions with the literacy, the resources, and the authority to write things down were governments, temples, and wealthy merchants. So when we find the word ilkum on these tablets, we're not just reading an administrative term, we're reading evidence of a social engineering project. We're reading the moment when someone in power decided that a certain group of people needed to be separated, classified, and controlled. But here's the twist that nobody likes to talk about. Every single authoritarian regime in history has made the same fundamental mistake. They believe that by writing something down, by making it official, by putting it in the record, they could make it true. They believed that classification equals control. And in a way, they were right. The Sumerians did control the Ilkum in some respects. They did marginalize them, separate them from the rest of society, and limit their rights and opportunities. But in another way, they were completely wrong, because by writing it down, they preserved the evidence of their own intentions. They created a record that, thousands of years later, would allow us to see exactly what they were trying to do. Modern historians and archaeologists didn't have to imagine what the Sumerian class system looked like. They could read about it. The Sumerians had done the work for them. And this pattern repeats everywhere you look in history. The Nazis kept meticulous records of their atrocities. The Roman slave traders documented transactions on papyrus. Medieval kingdoms created tax rolls and censuses that identified exactly which groups they were targeting for extra taxation or restrictions. The caste system in India was codified into text that made it explicit. Every regime that tried to solidify social hierarchy through bureaucratic means left behind the evidence of what they were doing. Now, you might be thinking, that's obvious. Of course they left records. That's what governments do. But the deeper point is this. The very act of creating that record, of formalizing that classification, changes something fundamental about how that system can function. Once something is official, it becomes difficult to deny. It becomes difficult to claim you didn't know. It becomes difficult to rewrite the narrative completely. The Sumerians couldn't later claim that the Ilkum never existed as a separate category, because the tablets proved otherwise. This actually has profound implications for how we understand power and control in ancient societies. The scholars who first studied the Ilkum tablets were looking at them from a purely economic angle. Oh, here's information about labor obligations. Here's data on state control of resources. Very dry, very administrative. But if you read between the lines, which is what the best historians do, you realize you're looking at something much more personal. You're looking at the anxiety of rulers who felt the need to control every aspect of society. You're looking at a system that required constant vigilance, constant documentation, constant reinforcement. If the Ilkum had truly been naturally subordinate, naturally suited for their role, there would be no need for all these tablets. There would be no need to keep writing it down. The fact that the system had to be repeated, formalized, and reinforced across multiple documents suggests something crucial. The people in power weren't confident in the legitimacy of their control. They were afraid. They knew that without constant bureaucratic reinforcement, the system might fall apart. And here's where I want to introduce something that modern psychology and social science have confirmed. Hierarchies based on forced classification are inherently unstable. They require more energy to maintain than naturally formed social structures. Think about groups that form organically: families, friend groups, communities with shared interests. These groups hold together through social bonds, shared experience, and genuine connection. They don't need constant bureaucratic reinforcement. But groups that are artificially separated, artificially ranked, artificially kept in subordinate positions, these groups require constant attention, constant rules, constant punishment for infractions, constant documentation to maintain. Why? Because deep down, everyone knows it's artificial. Everyone knows it could be different. And that creates an underlying tension that you can feel even in the archaeological record. The Sumerian tablets aren't just telling us about the Ilkum. They're telling us about the anxiety of the Sumerian ruling class. Now, there's something really important to understand about the economic situation that created the Ilkum in the first place. Sumeria around 2000 BCE was not a stable, prosperous civilization. It was fragmented. Different city-states competed with each other. There were constant small wars, territorial disputes, resource shortages. When resources are scarce and competition is fierce, governments become more oppressive. This is a pattern we see over and over throughout history. When times are good, societies can afford to be more permissive, more relaxed about hierarchy. When times are hard, elites crack down. The Ilkum emerged during a period of significant stress in Sumerian society. The government needed more control, not less. It needed more predictability, not less. So it created a system where a portion of the population had fewer rights, fewer options, and fewer ways to escape their assigned role. But, and this is crucial, the system couldn't completely dehumanize the Ilkum. The Sumerians weren't like some later empires. They didn't have an ideology of racial or biological inferiority that could justify complete chattel slavery. The Ilkum were still Sumerian. They still spoke the language. They still participated in the economy. So the system had to be something hybrid, something in between, something that could be explained as temporary or circumstantial, or even necessary for the good of society. And that's exactly what we see in the language used on the tablets. The Ilkum aren't described as slaves exactly, though they have many characteristics of slavery. They're described as people who have an obligation, people who owe something, people whose labor belongs to the state. It's a distinction that matters because it suggests a way of thinking about social control that doesn't require dehumanizing ideology. You don't need to convince people that the Ilkum are subhuman. You just need to convince them, and yourself, that the Ilkum have an obligation, that they owe something, that it's not injustice, it's economics. This is actually a more sophisticated system of control than simple slavery in some ways, because it doesn't raise the same moral questions. You can tell yourself that the Ilkum aren't being oppressed, they're just meeting an obligation. You can tell yourself it's temporary. You can tell yourself it could happen to anyone, and maybe someday it will be their turn to have obligations and someone else's turn to be free. For more on how this kind of linguistic manipulation worked in ancient societies and how it shaped entire civilizations, I've put together a deeper resource in the description and the pinned comment that walks through the actual archaeological evidence, tablet by tablet. It's the kind of system that allows oppression to persist while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy, and that's precisely what makes it so insidious. Because here's what I think is the most important insight from studying the Ilkum. Systems of oppression don't necessarily require the oppressors to believe in the inferiority of the oppressed. They just require the oppressors to believe in the necessity of the system. The Sumerian elites probably didn't wake up every morning thinking, I hate the Ilkum because they're inherently inferior. That would actually be less efficient, less stable. What they believed was, this system is necessary. This is how we maintain order. This is how we survive as a civilization. And that belief, the belief in necessity, is often far more powerful and far more enduring than ideology. Because you can fight against ideology. You can argue against someone's beliefs about your inferiority. But how do you fight against the argument that something is simply necessary? This is why the Ilkum system might have been so stable. It wasn't based on a belief that the Ilkum were fundamentally different or inferior. It was based on the claim that the system was functionally necessary, and therefore natural, and therefore unchangeable. But, and this is where the story gets really interesting for modern readers, the Ilkum tablets also give us evidence that this system, for all its stability and formality, was not actually as secure as the elites believed. There are hints in the tablets of resistance. There are hints of people trying to escape their Ilkum status. There are hints of the system having to be reinforced repeatedly, in different documents, across different time periods. If the system had been truly accepted and stable, why would they need to keep documenting it? The tablets themselves become evidence of instability. They're the Sumerian equivalent of a government having to constantly announce a policy because the people keep ignoring it. They're the equivalent of a law that needs to be passed again and again because people keep breaking it. In other words, the bureaucratic control that the Sumerians thought would stabilize their society actually reveals the opposite. It reveals a system under constant pressure, a system that couldn't maintain itself without constant reinforcement, a system that, despite all the tablets and all the official records, couldn't make people genuinely accept their assigned role. And that's a lesson that resonates through history right up to the modern era. The irony is almost poetic. The Sumerians created this elaborate system of documentation to prove that the system worked. They created tablets to legitimize the tablets. They wrote laws about the laws. And in doing so, they accidentally preserved the very evidence of their system's failure. What we're looking at isn't the record of a stable, accepted system. It's a paper trail of desperation. It's the administrative footprint of a society trying to hold together something that kept falling apart. Every new tablet, every new decree, every new refinement of the rules, it's evidence that the previous attempt didn't work. The repetition of rules across centuries tells us something crucial. They didn't stick. People didn't internalize them. Generations had to be told again what their parents were told. The Ilkum status had to be reinforced, re-explained, and re-justified because humans, even in ancient Mesopotamia, instinctively resist being told they were born for a specific purpose they didn't choose. Here's where most history books miss the real story. They focus on what the system was supposed to do, but the fascinating question is, why did it fail? Why couldn't a society with this level of organizational sophistication make people accept their predetermined role? The answer lies in something the Sumerians understood better than they wanted to admit. Humans have agency. Even when you're born into a status, even when society tells you that's your place, even when the law is written in clay and will outlast everyone you know, you still get to choose what you do with your life. You can work the system. You can run away. You can marry differently. You can teach your children differently. You can refuse. And the evidence suggests that people did, repeatedly, across generations. The system had to be continually reinforced because it was continually being resisted. Not always openly, not always dramatically, often just through the quiet choices of individuals trying to live differently than they were told. Now, if you want to understand how social systems actually persist despite their internal contradictions, I've created a deeper resource that explores the psychology behind why people accept or reject predetermined roles. You'll find it linked in the description and pinned in the comments. It's a guide that walks through historical and modern examples side by side. But here's what makes this story matter beyond ancient history. The Sumerian case study shows us something that's replayed throughout history. Rigid systems, no matter how elaborate, cannot force genuine compliance. They can force behavior. They can create rules. They can fill libraries with documentation, but they cannot change what people actually want for themselves or their children. Medieval feudalism tried it, industrial capitalism tried it, colonial systems tried it. All of them created elaborate justifications for why people belonged in their assigned positions. All of them documented why the system was natural, necessary, and permanent. And all of them eventually crumbled because people kept finding ways to move beyond the roles they were assigned. The difference between then and now is transparency. The Sumerians had to bury their contradictions in clay tablets and temple archives. We can see the pattern more clearly, and if we're paying attention, we can ask ourselves, where are we still trying to convince people that their current role is their only possible role? Whether it's education telling certain students they're not math people, or careers telling you that you have to stay in the lane you started in, or society suggesting that your family's economic status is permanent, these are the modern echoes of the Ilkham principle. And like the Sumerians learned, every time we try to enforce it, we're creating the documentation that proves it doesn't actually work. The final lesson from the tablets isn't about ancient Mesopotamia. It's about the gap between what systems claim about human nature and what human nature actually is. Systems claim that people are clay, that you can shape them once and they'll hold that shape forever. But people keep proving otherwise. We keep seeking, changing, moving, refusing. The tablets remain. The system they documented is dust, and that tells you everything you need to know about which one was real and which one was just wishful thinking. If you want to explore how these rigid systems actually collapse and what historical patterns can teach us about modern resistance and social change, I've put together a comprehensive breakdown in the description and pinned comment that goes way deeper into the psychology and sociology behind all of this. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of history's most fascinating contradictions. If this exploration of how systems really work resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next story that textbooks ignored. Like this video if it made you think differently about something you thought you already understood. I'll see you in the next one.